My girlfriend said, "Quit your startup. It's embarrassing dating someone without a real job." I said, "You're right." Then I sold my startup for $3.6 million while she was job hunting. She found out when local news called me for an interview. I, 31M, never thought a single conversation would change the entire trajectory of my life. But sometimes the universe has a twisted sense of humor. It was a Tuesday evening in March when she said it. We were sitting in our cramped apartment, takeout containers scattered across the coffee table, when she looked at me with that expression I'd grown to recognize, the one that meant another lecture was coming. She told me she was tired of explaining to her friends what I did for work, tired of the awkward silences when people asked about my job. Her exact words were burned into my memory. She wanted me to quit my startup because it was embarrassing dating someone without a real job. I sat there stunned. For 3 years, I'd been pouring everything into building a logistics software platform. 18-hour days, ramen dinners, maxed out credit cards, all while she climbed the corporate ladder at a marketing firm. I'd supported her promotions, celebrated her bonuses, never once calling her work meaningless even when she complained about it daily. She continued, saying her colleagues thought I was unemployed, that she was tired of being the only one paying for nice dinners and vacations. She wanted me to get a real job at a real company with a real salary. I looked at her, really looked at her, and realized something had fundamentally shifted. This wasn't about money or stability. This was about her being ashamed of me. I told her she was right. The relief on her face was immediate. She smiled and started talking about companies I should apply to, connections she could make, how much better our life would be once I had a proper job. I nodded along, letting her paint this picture of our future while something cold settled in my chest. That night, after she fell asleep, I sat at my laptop and made a decision that would change everything. Instead of job hunting, I started preparing for something else entirely. The next morning, I told her I was taking her advice and would start looking for traditional employment. She kissed me goodbye, practically bouncing with excitement about finally having a boyfriend with a respectable career. What I didn't tell her was that I'd already been in quiet negotiations with 2 companies interested in acquiring my startup for months. The conversations had been preliminary, more exploratory than serious, but they'd indicated significant interest in my platform. I spent the next week not job hunting, but lawyer hunting. I found the best tech acquisition attorney I could afford and explained my situation. He was intrigued by the potential value of my company and agreed to work on a success fee basis. Meanwhile, she had taken it upon herself to help with my job search. She printed out job postings, highlighted qualifications I met, and even reached out to her network on my behalf. Her enthusiasm would have been touching if it wasn't built on her fundamental misunderstanding of what I'd actually built. 2 weeks into her campaign to rehabilitate my career, I got the call I'd been hoping for. The larger of the 2 interested companies wanted to accelerate discussions. They'd been watching my platform's performance metrics, and user adoption had spiked dramatically in the past quarter. I scheduled a meeting for the following Monday, telling her I had a job interview. Technically, it wasn't a lie. The acquisition meeting went better than I could have dreamed. They'd done their due diligence and were impressed with not just the technology, but the user retention rates and revenue growth. By Wednesday, they'd made a preliminary offer that made my head spin. At home, she asked how my interviews were going. I told her they were promising, and she squeezed my hand encouragingly. She'd even started planning how we'd celebrate once I got an offer, talking about the fancy restaurant we'd go to with my first real paycheck. The irony wasn't lost on me. Over the next month, I played the strangest double life imaginable. During the day, I was negotiating the sale of my company, working with lawyers and accountants to structure the deal. In the evenings, I was pretending to be a desperate job seeker, letting her coach me on interview techniques and professional networking. She'd taken to staying late at work more often, and when I asked about it, she mentioned they were hiring for several new positions. She was helping with the recruitment process and finding it energizing to be around ambitious, successful people all day. The comment stung, but I kept my reaction neutral. By early May, the acquisition was nearly complete. The final offer was $3.6 million, more money than I'd ever imagined having. The legal team was handling the final paperwork, and we were looking at closing within 2 weeks. That's when she came home with news that changed everything. She'd been offered a promotion, but it came with a catch. The new position required relocating to the company's headquarters across the country. It was a significant step up in responsibility and salary, and she was clearly excited about it. She asked what I thought, and I could see she'd already made up her mind. This was her chance to escape what she saw as our mediocre life. I congratulated her and asked about the timeline. She said they wanted her to start in 6 weeks, which would give us time to figure out what I was doing for work and whether I'd be joining her. The assumption that I'd follow her wherever her career led was telling. She'd never asked if I wanted to relocate, just assumed I'd adapt my life to hers. I told her we should talk about it over the weekend when we had more time. She agreed, already mentally planning our cross-country move. That Friday, I got the call that the acquisition was finalized. The paperwork was complete, the money was being transferred, and I was officially no longer the owner of a struggling startup. I was now a millionaire. I sat in my car in the parking lot of the lawyer's office, staring at the contract in my hands, and felt something I hadn't experienced in years: complete freedom. I drove home to find her packing. She'd already started boxing up her things, assuming I'd agree to the move. When she saw me, she smiled brightly and asked how my job search was going. I told her I had some news to share over dinner. We went to the same mediocre chain restaurant we'd been going to for months, one of the few places we could afford on her salary. As she excitedly talked about her new job and our upcoming move, I found myself seeing her with complete clarity for the first time in months. When she finally paused to ask about my news, I told her I'd decided not to look for traditional employment after all. Her face fell immediately. She asked what I meant, and I explained that I'd realized she was right about one thing. I needed to make a change. Just not the change she'd envisioned. I told her about the acquisition, about the months of negotiations she'd been oblivious to, about the $3.6 million sitting in my bank account as of that morning. The color drained from her face. She asked if I was joking, and I showed her the bank statement on my phone. She stared at the number for a long moment, then looked back at me with an expression I'd never seen before. It wasn't quite anger, wasn't quite shock. It was something closer to betrayal. She asked why I hadn't told her, and I reminded her of our conversation in March. How she'd said my startup was embarrassing and I needed a real job. I told her I'd simply taken her advice and moved on to something more suitable. The silence that followed was deafening. She tried to backtrack then, saying she'd never meant I should give up entirely, just that maybe I should have found something more stable while building the company. That she'd been trying to help, not hurt. But we both knew that wasn't true. She'd been embarrassed by me, ashamed of what I was building, and now she was scrambling to rewrite history. I told her I thought the promotion was a great opportunity for her and that she should definitely take it. She asked if I'd be coming with her, and I said I didn't think that would be a good idea. She left that night to stay with a friend, saying she needed time to think. I didn't expect her to come back. Update 1. She returned 3 days later, apologetic and conciliatory. She said she'd been wrong to pressure me about getting a traditional job, that she should have supported my entrepreneurial efforts. She wanted to talk about our future together now that everything had changed. The conversation was surreal. She spoke as if the money had transformed not just my circumstances, but somehow validated everything I'd been doing all along. As if my work had only become legitimate once someone else had valued it highly enough. She said she could turn down the promotion, that maybe we should start over and plan our future together properly this time. She talked about investments we could make, trips we could take, the house we could buy. I listened to all of it and realized that nothing had actually changed in how she saw me. I'd simply moved from the embarrassing category to the valuable category in her mental filing system. I told her I thought she should take the job, that this was clearly what she wanted, and she shouldn't let my situation change her career plans. She asked if I was breaking up with her, and I said I thought we wanted different things from life. She'd made it clear that financial success and social status were important to her, and I respected that. But I'd also learned that I needed to be with someone who valued the work itself, not just the outcome. She cried and said she'd learned her lesson, that she would be different now. But I could see it in her eyes. She was calculating what she stood to lose by walking away. Update 2. The breakup was messy, but mercifully brief. She oscillated between anger and bargaining, sometimes within the same conversation. She accused me of being vindictive, of setting her up to look foolish. Other times she tried to convince me that we could make it work, that she understood now what she'd failed to see before. But the trust was gone. I kept thinking about all the times she'd belittled my work, all the eye rolls when I mentioned product developments or user feedback, how she'd made me feel small and foolish for believing in something she couldn't see the value in. She moved out 2 weeks later, taking the job across the country. Her last words to me were that I'd regret giving up someone who'd been with me through the struggling years. I thought about that for a long time afterward. She had been with me during the difficult period, but she hadn't been with me. She'd been tolerating me, waiting for me to become someone more acceptable. The local business journal ran a story about the acquisition a month after she left. It was a small piece, just a few paragraphs about local tech companies and successful exits, but they interviewed me about the experience of building a startup in our city's emerging tech scene. I didn't think much of it until my phone started buzzing with notifications. Friends and former colleagues were sharing the article, congratulating me on the success. My parents called, proud but slightly bewildered by the whole thing. Then I got a text from an unknown number. It was her, writing from her new city and new job. She'd seen the article when someone from her old office had shared it in a group chat. She said she was happy for me, that she'd always known I was capable of great things. She mentioned that her new job was going well, but that she missed our city and the life we'd built together. The message felt like a fishing expedition, testing the waters to see if success had made me more forgiving. I didn't respond. Update 3. 6 months later, I ran into her sister at a coffee shop. We'd always gotten along well, and she congratulated me on the business success. Then she mentioned that her sister had been having a tough time in her new city. The job was demanding, but not as fulfilling as she'd hoped. She was working long hours for a boss who reminded her a lot of the corporate culture she'd once thrived in, but now found exhausting. More importantly, she'd realized that she'd made a mistake in how she'd handled our relationship. I told her sister I hoped she found what she was looking for, and I meant it. I wasn't angry anymore, just sad about how things had ended. The sister asked if I'd consider talking to her, maybe giving her a chance to make amends. I thought about it for a long time before responding. I told her that some bridges, once burned, can't be rebuilt, not because of lack of forgiveness, but because they were built on a foundation that turned out to be unstable. I'd learned that I needed to be with someone who believed in my dreams when they were just dreams, not after they'd been validated by external success. She nodded, understanding. Before she left, she mentioned that her sister had been dating someone new, but that it wasn't serious. That she talked about me often, usually in the context of the life she could have had. I felt a complex mix of emotions hearing that, but mostly I felt grateful. Grateful that I'd learned an important lesson about what I needed from a partner. Grateful that I'd found the courage to walk away from something that looked right but felt wrong. The money from the acquisition gave me freedom to choose what came next, but the experience of building and selling the company taught me something more valuable: the importance of surrounding yourself with people who see your potential before the world does. A year later, I started my second company. This time, I was more careful about who I let into my inner circle, both professionally and personally. I dated sparingly, but when I did meet someone special, I paid attention to how they reacted to my work when it was just a bunch of ideas and late nights. I never heard from her directly again, though mutual friends occasionally mentioned that she'd moved back to town and was working for a different company. I wished her well from a distance, holding no grudges but no regrets either. The experience taught me that sometimes the most hurtful comments come from the people closest to us, but they can also be the catalyst for the most important changes in our lives. Her dismissal of my work had forced me to examine what I was truly building and why it mattered. In a strange way, I was grateful for that March evening when she told me to quit my embarrassing fake job. It had revealed something essential about both of us and set us both free to find what we were actually looking for. Sometimes the best revenge is simply becoming the person you were meant to be, with or without the people who couldn't see it coming.